In the pursuit of truth, clarity is essential. We have stripped away the narrative to show you unfiltered, unedited reality. Witness raw, compelling footage from the front lines of justice, allowing the actual events to speak entirely for themselves.
Hey, stop right there. Who are you and why are you here?
I'm Judge Rebecca Lawson. I'm leaving work and going to my car.
Show me your ID, now.
Here is my judicial identification.
That looks suspicious. Give me another ID.
Officer, I'm recording. I have the right to do so.
Turn that phone off.
The body camera footage showed exactly what happened on that humid Tuesday afternoon outside the Riverside County Courthouse. A distinguished African-American woman in her early 50s walked down the courthouse steps wearing her judicial robes, carrying her briefcase, heading toward her personal vehicle in the designated parking area. She had just finished presiding over a complex criminal trial that had lasted 3 days. What she didn't know was that Officer David Grant had been watching her from across the street, and something about her presence had triggered a response that would cost the city $16 million and destroy multiple careers forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from around the world. And if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button because this case will blow your mind with how it unfolds. The woman at the center of this storm was Judge Rebecca Lawson, a respected member of the judiciary who had spent the last 12 years on the bench after working as a prosecutor for 8 years before that. She had earned her law degree from Harvard, graduated summa cum laude, and built a reputation for fairness, intelligence, and unwavering dedication to justice. She lived quietly in an upscale neighborhood, drove a modest sedan, and was known throughout the legal community as someone who treated everyone with dignity, regardless of their background or circumstances. That Tuesday afternoon, Judge Lawson had one simple goal: get to her car, drive home, and prepare for the next day's court calendar. She had parked in the same designated spot she used every day, clearly marked for judicial personnel. Nothing about this routine should have attracted any attention whatsoever. She walked with purpose but not urgency, her judicial robes flowing slightly in the afternoon breeze. Other courthouse employees and attorneys passed by, nodding respectfully as they recognized her. Everything was completely normal until Officer Grant decided to make it otherwise. Officer David Grant had been with the city police department for 15 years. He patrolled the courthouse district regularly, supposedly maintaining security and order in the area. On paper, his record looked decent enough. No major scandals, no obvious red flags that might have warned his superiors about what was coming. But what the personnel files didn't show was a pattern of behavior that multiple witnesses would later describe under oath. Grant had a problem with successful people of color, particularly those he perceived as having authority or status that somehow threatened his own sense of power and control. As Judge Lawson approached her vehicle, Grant crossed the street and called out to her. His tone was immediately confrontational, demanding to know who she was and what she was doing in the area. Judge Lawson stopped, turned around, and politely identified herself. She explained that she was a sitting judge and was simply going to her car after finishing court business for the day. Any reasonable person would have apologized for the confusion and moved on. Officer Grant was not a reasonable person. Instead of backing down, Grant stepped closer and demanded to see identification. Judge Lawson remained calm and professional, though she was already recognizing the dangerous territory she had entered. She reached into her briefcase and produced her judicial identification card, which clearly showed her photograph, name, title, and official seal. Grant barely glanced at it before claiming it looked suspicious and demanding additional forms of identification. Here's where Judge Lawson made a decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. Rather than escalating the confrontation or trying to pull rank, she calmly reached for her phone and began recording the interaction. She had seen too many cases come through her courtroom where the only evidence was one person's word against another's. She understood the power of documentation and the importance of creating an undeniable record of what was happening. The moment that phone came out, Officer Grant's behavior shifted dramatically. He raised his voice and ordered her to stop recording immediately. Judge Lawson calmly explained that she had every legal right to record a public official performing their duties in a public space. She stated this in the measured, authoritative tone she used when explaining legal principles to defendants and attorneys in her courtroom. Grant did not appreciate being lectured about the law by someone he was clearly determined to intimidate. What happened next was captured in crystal clear video and audio. Grant moved closer to Judge Lawson, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly designed to intimidate. He told her that recording police officers was illegal and that she could be arrested for obstruction of justice. Both statements were completely false, and Judge Lawson knew it better than almost anyone. She had ruled on numerous cases involving citizens' rights to record police interactions. She knew the law backward and forward. Judge Lawson responded by calmly reciting the relevant legal precedents that protected her right to record. She mentioned specific case law by name and citation number. She explained that she was standing on a public sidewalk, engaging in constitutionally protected activity, and had committed no crime whatsoever. Her legal knowledge should have been a clear signal to Grant that he was dealing with someone who understood their rights. Instead, it seemed to make him angrier. Grant then made his first major tactical error. He grabbed Judge Lawson's phone, attempting to stop the recording. The judge immediately stated clearly for the audio record that she did not consent to being touched and that the officer was now committing battery against her person. She demanded that he return her property immediately and step back to a respectful distance. Grant refused and actually moved closer, now standing inches from her face. Other people in the area were beginning to notice the commotion. A few courthouse employees who recognized Judge Lawson stopped to watch from a distance. Several attorneys who had been leaving the building after finishing their own court business paused to observe what was happening. Some of them began recording on their own phones. A small crowd was forming, and Grant was creating exactly the kind of public spectacle that would make this incident impossible to cover up or downplay later. Judge Lawson continued speaking calmly into her phone's camera, narrating what was happening for the record. She stated the time, date, and location. She described Grant's behavior in precise legal terms. She noted that multiple witnesses were present. She was essentially creating a real-time legal record that would be devastating in any subsequent legal proceedings. Every word she spoke demonstrated her complete understanding of the law and her absolute right to be where she was, doing what she was doing. Have you ever witnessed something like this happening in your community? Drop a yes in the comments if you've seen this kind of behavior from law enforcement officers. Grant's next move was even more problematic. He told Judge Lawson that she needed to come with him for questioning. When she asked whether she was being arrested, he said no. When she asked whether she was free to leave, he said no. Judge Lawson immediately pointed out that this constituted unlawful detention under the Fourth Amendment. She explained that an officer cannot detain someone without reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, and that no such reasonable suspicion existed in this situation. The judge then did something that would later prove to be brilliant. She asked Grant to articulate his reasonable suspicion on camera. She wanted him to explain, in his own words, what specific criminal activity he suspected her of engaging in. Grant's response was a rambling, incoherent explanation about suspicious behavior and the need to verify identities in the courthouse area. Nothing he said came close to meeting the legal standard for reasonable suspicion, and Judge Lawson pointed this out in real time. By now, the crowd of witnesses had grown to include several other judges who had finished their court sessions and were leaving the building. When they recognized their colleague being harassed by the police officer, some of them approached and identified themselves to Grant. They vouched for Judge Lawson's identity and asked why she was being detained. Grant told them to mind their own business and move along or face arrest themselves. This was Grant's second major tactical error. He was now threatening to arrest multiple sitting judges for the crime of standing on a public sidewalk and asking questions about why their colleague was being detained. The absurdity of the situation was becoming more apparent by the minute, but Grant seemed incapable of recognizing how badly he was handling things. Judge Lawson continued recording and narrating the entire interaction. She noted each person who arrived to witness what was happening. She documented Grant's threats against the other judges. She captured his increasingly erratic and aggressive behavior. The video would later show that at no point did she raise her voice, use profanity, make threats, or engage in any behavior that could remotely be considered disruptive or criminal. The situation continued to escalate when Grant called for backup. Within minutes, 3 additional police cars arrived at the scene. The other officers who responded seemed confused about why they had been summoned. They looked around at the crowd of well-dressed professionals, many of whom they recognized as judges and attorneys, and appeared to sense that something was very wrong with this situation. Judge Lawson addressed the newly arrived officers directly. She calmly explained who she was, showed them her judicial identification, and described what had been happening. She told them she had been attempting to leave the courthouse and go to her car when Officer Grant had detained her without cause. She said she had been recording the interaction to protect herself and document any potential civil rights violations. The senior officer among the backup, Sergeant Williams, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation immediately. He had been with the department for over 20 years and had never seen anything quite like this. A sitting judge being detained outside the courthouse she worked in, surrounded by her judicial colleagues, with everything being recorded by multiple cameras. This was a public relations nightmare waiting to happen, and potentially much worse. Sergeant Williams attempted to de-escalate by speaking quietly with Grant, trying to understand what had prompted this detention. Grant's explanation was even less coherent when he tried to relay it to his supervisor. He talked about suspicious behavior, identity verification, and disrespect for police authority. Nothing he said justified the detention of a judge who had clearly identified herself and was simply trying to go to her car. Meanwhile, Judge Lawson stood quietly, still recording, still narrating the proceedings for her video record. She had now been detained for over 20 minutes without cause. She had missed appointments, and her family was probably wondering why she was late getting home. But she understood that how this situation was resolved would have implications far beyond her own inconvenience. Venience. The situation was rapidly spiraling beyond anything the responding officers had ever encountered in their careers. Sergeant Williams realized he was facing a potential lawsuit that could bankrupt the city, destroy reputations, and end careers. He quietly suggested to Grant that perhaps they should release Judge Lawson immediately and apologize for any misunderstanding. Grant's response shocked everyone within earshot. He doubled down, insisting that the judge was being disrespectful and needed to be taught a lesson about proper behavior around law enforcement. At this point, Judge Lawson made another strategic decision that would prove devastating to the city's later legal defense. She began asking very specific questions designed to create an even more detailed record of what was happening. She asked Grant to state his full name and badge number for the camera. She asked him to explain the specific statute or ordinance she was allegedly violating. She asked him to describe the training he had received regarding citizens' rights to record police interactions. Grant's answers to these questions were catastrophic for any potential defense the city might later attempt. He refused to provide his badge number. He could not cite any specific law that Judge Lawson was violating. He claimed that recording police was always illegal, demonstrating his complete ignorance of well-established constitutional law. Every word coming out of his mouth was creating evidence that would be used against him and the city in federal court. The other judges and attorneys who had gathered were now openly discussing what they were witnessing. Several of them were also recording the interaction on their phones. One attorney called his law firm's managing partner to describe what was happening. Another judge contacted the chief judge of the circuit court to report that one of their colleagues was being unlawfully detained by city police. Word was spreading quickly through the legal community that something extraordinary was taking place outside the courthouse. Judge Lawson then asked to speak with Grant's supervisor about filing a formal complaint. She wanted his supervisor's name and the procedure for reporting misconduct. Grant told her she could file all the complaints she wanted, but right now she was going to do what he told her to do. This exchange was particularly damaging because it showed Grant's complete disregard for accountability and his belief that he was above any consequences for his actions. By this time, the crowd had grown to include court clerks, bailiffs, and other courthouse personnel who had heard about the commotion and come outside to see what was happening. Many of these people had worked with Judge Lawson for years and were shocked to see her being treated this way. Their presence created even more witnesses and even more people who would later be able to testify about what they had observed. Sergeant Williams was becoming increasingly desperate to end this situation before it got any worse. He approached Judge Lawson directly and asked if there was anything he could do to resolve the matter. Judge Lawson's response was measured and professional. She said she wanted Officer Grant to return her phone, step back to a respectful distance, and either arrest her or release her immediately. She said the prolonged detention without cause was a clear violation of her constitutional rights, and every additional minute was creating additional liability for the city. The sergeant then made what he probably thought was a diplomatic suggestion. He offered to escort Judge Lawson to her car and ensure she could leave safely if she would agree not to file a complaint about the incident. This offer was recorded by multiple cameras and would later be characterized by Judge Lawson's attorneys as attempted witness tampering and obstruction of justice. The sergeant had just suggested that the judge trade away her right to seek redress for civil rights violations in exchange for being allowed to exercise her right to leave a public place. Judge Lawson's response was swift and definitive. She stated clearly that she would not be making any deals or agreements that would prevent her from pursuing legal remedies for what had happened to her. She said that public officials who violated citizens' constitutional rights needed to be held accountable through the proper legal channels. She said that was how the system was supposed to work, and she would not be part of covering up misconduct or corruption. At this point, Grant made his most serious error yet. Frustrated by his inability to control the situation and humiliate Judge Lawson as he had apparently intended, he decided to arrest her. He announced that she was being arrested for disorderly conduct, obstruction of justice, and resisting arrest. The crowd of witnesses erupted in shocked murmurs and comments. Several people could be heard saying that the judge had been completely calm and cooperative throughout the entire interaction. Judge Lawson responded to the arrest announcement by clearly stating for the record that she was not resisting arrest and would comply with lawful orders, but that the arrest itself was unlawful and without probable cause. She asked Grant to articulate the probable cause for each charge he had announced. His responses were incoherent and legally meaningless. He talked about her attitude and her refusal to show proper respect for law enforcement authority. None of this came close to meeting the legal standard for any of the charges he had mentioned. As Grant attempted to place handcuffs on Judge Lawson, she continued narrating for her phone's camera, which was still recording. She described the physical contact, noted the time, and stated that she was not resisting but was being arrested without probable cause. Her calm, professional demeanor throughout this ordeal was creating a stark contrast with Grant's increasingly erratic and aggressive behavior. The handcuffs clicked into place, and Judge Lawson was now under arrest outside the courthouse where she had worked for over a decade. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. A respected judge, known for her fairness and dedication to justice, was being arrested by a police officer who clearly had no understanding of the law he was supposed to enforce. The irony would later be noted in newspaper editorials and legal commentaries across the country. Several of the witnessing attorneys immediately began making phone calls. They contacted bail bondsmen, criminal defense lawyers, and civil rights organizations. They were already mobilizing resources to ensure that Judge Lawson would be released as quickly as possible and that her legal interests would be protected. The legal community was rallying around one of their own, who had been subjected to what they all recognized as outrageous misconduct. Grant escorted Judge Lawson to his patrol car while she continued to record and narrate. She noted that she was being placed in the back seat of the police vehicle despite not having committed any crime. She stated that this arrest was being conducted in retaliation for her exercising her constitutional rights to record police activity and to ask questions about the legal basis for her detention. As the patrol car pulled away from the courthouse, Grant probably thought he had won some kind of victory. He had shown this uppity judge who was really in charge. He had demonstrated his authority and put her in her place. What he had actually done was create a federal civil rights case that would destroy his career, cost the city millions of dollars, and expose a pattern of misconduct that would lead to widespread reforms and multiple terminations. The booking process at the city jail was captured by surveillance cameras and documented in official records. Judge Lawson was fingerprinted, photographed, and processed like any other arrestee. Throughout the entire procedure, she remained calm and cooperative while continuing to state for the record that her arrest was unlawful and that she intended to pursue all available legal remedies. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt powerless against someone abusing their authority? Let me know in the comments what you think should happen to officers who abuse their power like this. News of Judge Lawson's arrest spread through the legal community like wildfire. Within hours, the story was being covered by local news outlets. By the next morning, it had been picked up by national media. The video that Judge Lawson had recorded was being viewed millions of times across social media platforms. Legal experts were analyzing the footage and unanimously concluding that the arrest was completely unjustified and that massive civil rights violations had occurred. The city's response was immediate damage control mode. The mayor held a press conference expressing concern about the incident and promising a thorough investigation. The police chief announced that Officer Grant had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of an internal affairs investigation. The city attorney was probably already calculating how much this case was going to cost taxpayers and whether there was any possible defense to the inevitable federal lawsuit. Judge Lawson was released on her own recognizance after spending 8 hours in jail. Her first stop after leaving the detention facility was not home to rest and recover from her ordeal. Instead, she went directly to the offices of the most prominent civil rights law firm in the state. She had decided that this case was about more than just her own mistreatment. It was about holding accountable a system that allowed officers like Grant to abuse their power with impunity. The legal team that took her case was led by attorney Sarah Mitchell, a Harvard Law graduate who had won some of the largest police misconduct verdicts in the state's history. Mitchell immediately recognized that this case had the potential to be a landmark victory for civil rights. The video evidence was crystal clear, the legal violations were obvious, and the defendant was a sitting judge who had documented everything in real time with the precision of a trained legal professional. Mitchell's first move was to file a federal lawsuit under Section 1983, the civil rights statute that allows citizens to sue government officials who violate their constitutional rights under color of law. The complaint was a devastating document that laid out in precise detail every constitutional violation that had occurred. It described the unlawful detention, the retaliatory arrest, the excessive force, and the pattern of misconduct that the investigation would soon reveal. The city's insurance company was contacted immediately about the potential liability. After reviewing the video evidence and the strength of Judge Lawson's legal team, they recommended settling the case as quickly as possible. The exposure was simply too great and the evidence too overwhelming to risk going to trial. But Judge Lawson had other ideas about how this case should be resolved. She refused the city's initial settlement offers, even when they reached into the millions. Judge Lawson understood that accepting a quick payout would allow the system to continue operating the way it always had. Officers like Grant would receive minimal punishment, policies would remain unchanged, and other citizens would continue to face the same abuse of power that she had experienced. This wasn't just about compensation for her suffering. This was about systemic reform and accountability. The discovery phase of the lawsuit revealed information that shocked even Judge Lawson's experienced legal team. Officer Grant's personnel file contained 17 previous complaints of racial profiling and excessive force. 17. Every single complaint had been filed by African American citizens who described encounters remarkably similar to what Judge Lawson had endured. The department had investigated each complaint internally and found no wrongdoing in any of them. One complaint came from Dr. James Harrison, a prominent surgeon who had been stopped while leaving the hospital after performing emergency surgery. Grant had detained him for over an hour, demanding multiple forms of identification and searching his vehicle without consent. Another complaint was filed by Professor Linda Jackson, a university dean who had been arrested after questioning why Grant was following her through a shopping center. The pattern was unmistakable and had been ignored by supervisors for years. The internal affairs files showed that Grant's behavior had been escalating steadily over his 15-year career. Early complaints described inappropriate traffic stops and aggressive questioning. More recent incidents involved unlawful searches, false arrests, and increasingly hostile encounters with successful African Americans. The department had documented this progression without taking any meaningful corrective action. Even more damaging was the discovery of text messages and emails between Grant and other officers. These communications revealed a culture of racism and contempt for civil rights that permeated significant portions of the department. Officers joked about targeting uppity minorities and shared strategies for making arrests that would be difficult to challenge legally. The messages showed a deliberate effort to intimidate and humiliate citizens who dared to question police authority. Judge Lawson's legal team also uncovered training records that proved the department knew officers were violating constitutional rights, but had failed to provide adequate education or supervision. The training materials on citizens' rights to record police interactions were outdated and inaccurate. Officers were being taught procedures that federal courts had ruled unconstitutional years earlier. The department had been operating in willful ignorance of established legal precedents. The city tried desperately to limit the scope of discovery, arguing that examining the entire department's practices was beyond the scope of Judge Lawson's individual case. Federal Judge Robert Chen disagreed. He ruled that the pattern and practice evidence was directly relevant to determining whether the constitutional violations were the result of individual misconduct or systemic failures. The city would have to produce records going back 5 years, covering hundreds of officers and thousands of civilian encounters. Media coverage of the case intensified as more details emerged through court filings and depositions. National civil rights organizations joined the case as interested parties, filing briefs that placed Judge Lawson's experience in the broader context of police misconduct against African Americans. Legal scholars wrote articles analyzing the case's potential impact on future civil rights litigation. The story became a focal point for discussions about racial profiling, police accountability, and the justice system's treatment of minorities. Grant's deposition was a disaster for the city's defense. Under oath, he doubled down on his actions and showed no remorse for what had happened. He claimed that Judge Lawson had been disrespectful and needed to be taught a lesson about proper behavior around police officers. When asked about her constitutional rights, he dismissed them as technicalities that interfered with law enforcement. His testimony revealed a complete lack of understanding of the legal principles that governed his job. The city's legal team tried to argue that Grant had been acting within his discretionary authority as a police officer. They claimed that his initial contact with Judge Lawson was a legitimate security check in a sensitive area near the courthouse. This argument collapsed when Judge Lawson's attorneys introduced evidence showing that Grant had never stopped any white professionals in the same area under similar circumstances. The discriminatory pattern was undeniable. Sergeant Williams, who had tried to de-escalate the situation, was also deposed and provided testimony that further undermined the city's position. He admitted that he had recognized immediately that Grant's detention of Judge Lawson was problematic. He acknowledged that offering to release her in exchange for not filing a complaint was inappropriate. His testimony confirmed that the department's supervision was inadequate and that officers were not being held accountable for constitutional violations. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed that Grant suffered from what the expert described as authority compensation syndrome, a condition where individuals with deep-seated insecurity seek to assert dominance over others through the abuse of institutional power. The psychologist noted that Grant specifically targeted successful minorities because their achievements threatened his fragile sense of self-worth. This clinical assessment provided a framework for understanding the systematic nature of his misconduct. Public pressure on the city continued to mount as community organizations organized protests and demanded comprehensive police reform. The local chapter of the NAACP called for Grant's prosecution on federal civil rights charges. Religious leaders from across the city signed a letter condemning the department's culture of racism and calling for new leadership. Business groups expressed concern that the city's reputation was being damaged by the ongoing controversy. The financial impact on the city was becoming severe even before any verdict or settlement. The insurance company had raised premiums dramatically and was threatening to cancel coverage entirely if significant reforms were not implemented. Several major corporations reconsidered expansion plans in the city, citing concerns about the local government's commitment to civil rights. Tourism revenue declined as convention organizers chose other destinations for their events. Judge Lawson used her platform as the case proceeded to speak publicly about police reform and civil rights. She gave speeches at law schools, civil rights conferences, and community forums. Her message was consistent. Individual bad actors like Grant were symptoms of systemic problems that required comprehensive solutions. She called for better training, stronger oversight, and real consequences for officers who violated constitutional rights. The City Council held emergency sessions to discuss the crisis and potential responses. Several members called for the police chief's resignation and a complete overhaul of department policies and procedures. Others argued for patience and allowing the legal process to run its course. The political divisions reflected broader community tensions about race, policing, and accountability that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Grant's union initially defended him and provided legal representation, arguing that he was being scapegoated for department-wide problems. However, as more evidence emerged about his pattern of misconduct and the explicit nature of his discriminatory targeting, union leadership quietly distanced themselves from his case. They recognized that defending his actions would damage their credibility in future negotiations and grievance procedures. The Federal Department of Justice opened its own investigation into the city's police practices, citing the pattern of civil rights violations revealed in Judge Lawson's case. This parallel investigation put additional pressure on the city to reach a settlement and implement meaningful reforms. Federal oversight would be far more intrusive and expensive than resolving the civil lawsuit, creating additional incentive for the city to negotiate seriously. Expert witnesses testified about the lasting psychological impact of Grant's actions on Judge Lawson. Despite her professional composure and legal expertise, she had been traumatized by the experience of being handcuffed and arrested without cause. She described feeling violated and humiliated in a way that her legal training had not prepared her to handle. The experts explained how such experiences could affect trust in institutions and willingness to participate in public service. The economic analysis presented by Judge Lawson's attorneys showed that the city's potential liability extended far beyond her individual case. If the pattern of misconduct continued unchecked, the municipality faced hundreds of millions in future settlements and verdicts. The cost of implementing comprehensive reforms was actually less expensive than continuing to defend and pay judgments in civil rights cases. This financial reality became a powerful argument for systemic change. Community leaders organized a coalition demanding not just monetary compensation for Judge Lawson, but structural changes that would prevent similar incidents in the future. They called for civilian oversight of police misconduct investigations, mandatory body cameras for all officers, regular bias training, and transparent reporting of complaint statistics. The coalition grew to include religious groups, professional organizations, student groups, and civil rights advocates. As the trial date approached, the city faced a choice between fighting a case they were almost certain to lose or negotiating a settlement that would require admitting fault and implementing expensive reforms. The political pressure was immense, with the mayor's re-election prospects hanging in the balance. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for Judge Lawson and widespread dissatisfaction with the police department's handling of the situation. The city's final settlement offer was unprecedented in scope and dollar amount: $16 million in compensation for Judge Lawson, plus an additional $20 million for a fund to compensate other victims of police misconduct. The agreement also required the implementation of comprehensive reforms including federal oversight, new training protocols, civilian review boards, and the termination of multiple officers including Grant. It was the largest police misconduct settlement in the state's history. Judge Lawson accepted the settlement not because the money mattered to her personally, but because the reform provisions would protect future victims from experiencing what she had endured. The agreement established monitoring mechanisms that would remain in place for 10 years, ensuring that changes would be sustained beyond the initial implementation period. It created a model that other cities would later adopt in their own reform efforts. Officer Grant was terminated and stripped of his pension benefits. His law enforcement certification was permanently revoked, ensuring he could never work as a police officer anywhere in the country again. He faced federal criminal charges for civil rights violations and was ultimately sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. His career, his reputation, and his freedom were all casualties of that Tuesday afternoon when he decided to target Judge Lawson. The police chief resigned in disgrace, followed by 2 assistant chiefs and the head of internal affairs. The department underwent the most comprehensive restructuring in its history. New leadership implemented body cameras, bias training, and civilian oversight boards. The culture of impunity that had protected officers like Grant for years was systematically dismantled and replaced with accountability measures that actually worked. Judge Lawson returned to her bench with renewed purpose, knowing that her willingness to fight back had created lasting change. The $16 million settlement sent a clear message that constitutional violations would carry severe financial consequences. But more importantly, the reforms she demanded meant that future victims would have better protection and real recourse when their rights were violated. This case proves that even the most powerful institutions can be held accountable when citizens refuse to accept injustice. Judge Lawson could have taken an early settlement and moved on quietly, but she chose to fight for systemic change that would benefit everyone. Her courage in that courthouse parking lot transformed not just her own city, but became a model for police reform nationwide. This case was disturbing, but the one on the right ends in a way no one expects.
Welcome to a channel dedicated to the absolute truth. We believe in holding power to account by carefully examining the evidence. Opinions vary, but the records don't lie. Thank you so much for watching today.